Mimi ni mdhambi, lakini bado wanipa uzima bure. Dhambi zote zimo kwangu, na bado wanipa neema bure. Mungu, nifanye nini niwe msafi kama theluji? Neema yako iwe kwangu, mimi niwe nuru kwa walimwengu, na jina lako lipate sifa kwa wote. Wewe ni Mungu muweza yote. Mimi ni mdhambi, lakini bado wanipa uzima bure. Dhambi zote zimo kwangu, na bado wanipa neema bure. Mungu, nifanye nini niwe msafi kama theluji? Neema yako iwe kwangu, mimi niwe nuru kwa walimwengu, na jina lako lipate sifa kwa wote. Wewe ni Mungu muweza yote. Acheni tusifu jina lake, Mungu wetu mkuu. Aliwavusha wana Israeli bahari ya Shamu. Sisi tuwe na imani kwake, tutashinda yote ya dunia. Asifiwe, atukuzwe, yeye ni mkuu. Acheni tusifu jina lake, Mungu wetu mkuu. Aliwavusha wana Israeli bahari ya Shamu. Sisi tuwe na imani kwake, tutashinda yote ya dunia. Asifiwe, atukuzwe, yeye ni mkuu. Wote turudi hekaluni, tutubu dhambi zetu, tuanze safari upya. Tuhubiri injili ya Bwana, wasioamini warudi zizini. Yesu atuita wenye dhambi tupate pumziko, tufurahie uzima wa milele, huku tukizunguka kiti cha enzi, tukiimba haleluya na Bwana, sisi ni washindi wa dhambi. Wote turudi hekaluni, tutubu dhambi zetu, tuanze safari upya. Tuhubiri injili ya Bwana, wasioamini warudi zizini. Yesu atuita wenye dhambi tupate pumziko, tufurahie uzima wa milele, huku tukizunguka kiti cha enzi, tukiimba haleluya na Bwana, sisi ni washindi wa dhambi. Acheni tusifu jina lake, Mungu wetu mkuu. Aliwavusha wana Israeli bahari ya Shamu. Sisi tuwe na imani kwake, tutashinda yote ya dunia. Asifiwe, atukuzwe, yeye ni mkuu. Acheni tusifu jina lake, Mungu wetu mkuu. Aliwavusha wana Israeli bahari ya Shamu. Sisi tuwe na imani kwake, tutashinda yote ya dunia. Asifiwe, atukuzwe, yeye ni mkuu. Acheni tusifu jina lake, Mungu wetu mkuu. Aliwavusha wana Israeli bahari ya Shamu. Sisi tuwe na imani kwake, tutashinda yote ya dunia. Asifiwe, atukuzwe, yeye ni mkuu. Acheni tusifu jina lake, Mungu wetu mkuu. Aliwavusha wana Israeli bahari ya Shamu. sisi tuwe na imani kwake, tutashinda yote ya dunia. Asifiwe, atukuzwe, yeye ni mkuu.
Praise the Lord. God is good. And all the time, I think it's really cold today. People are not responding. Now, I am told it will not be possible to use the screens right now. So unfortunately, you'll not be able to see what I'm seeing here. I'll have to narrate it to you. So I hope, though, that maybe in the course of the presentation, they might be able to do that. Yesterday, on our first day, we looked at the two perspectives on health. And we said one of those perspectives is the evolution theory. And we looked at how it shapes our understanding of disease and the interventions, our choice of intervention when we are in trouble, when we are ill, when we have disease. And we also looked at the account creation and looked at the implications of using the evolution theory to understand, to define disease and to intervene in cases of disease. Yesterday, we started confronting the villains of germ theory, and we started on viruses. We did not finish that presentation, and today we are going to continue where we left. Okay, not exactly where we left, because if we had more time yesterday, we would have looked at antibodies and their specificity, or rather the lack thereof. But that will have to wait for another time. Today, I want us to go back to history a little. We did a little history yesterday. Today, I want us to revisit the year 1918. Now, I mentioned it yesterday. Who can remember what happened in 1918? Yes? Yes, we had the Spanish flu. And I said yesterday when COVID came, we were told the best thing we can look at to understand what we were having, the pandemic we were having, was the Spanish flu. And we are told during 1918, that pandemic, the Spanish flu, around 50 million people worldwide lost their lives. So it was a major thing. Did COVID get there? COVID didn't get there, yes. So we are told 50 million people lost their lives during those years, 1918, 1919, because of the Spanish flu. And I thought it would be good, in view of what we are doing, to revisit the Spanish flu. I don't know whether it's on that. Is it on that screen yet? Okay. So we are told that during that time, they made frantic efforts to try and find out how this disease was being transmitted. It was a matter of public concern to understand whether this disease was contagious and how that happened. How did people infect each other? So that was the most important question then. And I think it is still the most important question now. How does that happen? Does it happen at all? So they did experiments in this was a United States Public Health Service committee, and they did it at a quarantine station in Gallops Island in Boston. So this is public record. Those who are interested can go and search for these experiments, and it will make very interesting reading. Now, their subjects for study were between 18 and 25. Now, they used army men. I know medical ethics today would not allow anyone to do the experiments that were done in those years. But those years, anything went. So they took army men who were between 18 years and 25 years. And we are told they took 100 of them who had had the flu. Then they took a few who had not had the flu for purposes of control. So it was a very good experiment. It was well done. Now, this was their method. So the experiment consisted of taking inoculations of pure cultures of what was called Pfeiffer bacillus. Now, at that time, they did not know what caused the flu. And one researcher called Pfeiffer had a theory. He said there was a certain bacteria that was causing the flu and that was very contagious. So it was named Pfeiffer's bacillus, that particular microorganism. So they would take pure cultures of that bacteria. Then they would take secretions from the upper respiratory passages. And then they would take blood from typical cases of influenza. Then these samples, this which they took, they would smear on volunteers' noses and throats. And then they would take the blood and inject it into healthy subjects. Now, when they did that the first time, we are told they started with 3 who had not had the flu and 3 who had a history of the flu. But we are told none of them got sick. So they proceeded with their experiment. And this time they took a suspension. They used a suspension of the same. They took a swab and smeared that same thing in the noses and throats of volunteers. And they made sure this time the interval between securing whatever they took from those who were sick and smearing it in the volunteers was not more than 30 seconds. Now, how long are we told the germs, the flu germ lasts before it dies? Okay, we are not aware. How many? We do not know. All right. So they made sure it was less than 30 seconds. So that should it be possible to kill that germ somewhere in transit, they would avoid that risk. But we are told in that experiment, none of the volunteers got sick. So they went to the next step. They took secretions from 5 typical cases of influenza. So they filtered that and they inoculated it subcutaneously. So they used a syringe and injected that into the volunteers. Then we are told at the same time blood was drawn from 5 cases and it was pooled together. So 5 different people who were sick, because they thought maybe the people we had taken this from initially were not sick enough to infect others. So they decided to pool blood from several people who were sick. Then they took that and injected it into 10 volunteers. We are told none of the men who were subjected to these things got sick. So when the initial trials failed, they decided to get bolder. And this time, they selected 19 of their volunteers and gave each one of them a very large quantity of a mixture of 13 different strains of Pfeiffer bacillus. Said, okay, maybe the bacillus, the strain we are using is not infectious. So let us try and experiment with others. So they isolated 13 strains of this bacillus. And they took that and inoculated it into the volunteers. We are told no one got sick. So they became bolder. They went ahead and obtained secretions from lungs at necropsy, meaning from a corpse. So they took that, they mixed it with the other strains they had, and they injected that. But we are told none of the volunteers got sick. Now, when they took these suspensions, when they made their broth of the strains of bacillus and other secretions from the upper respiratory tract, they would take an atomizer and spray that into the nose to make sure it went as far back as possible. And while they were doing that, they would ask the volunteers to breathe in. Then they would do that to the back of the throat and the eyes as well. Now we are told those are the avenues that we get infected through. So they would do that. And the record states that they used billions of those microorganisms, according to their estimated count. But they record that none of them took sick. None of them became sick. Then that doctor records and says, then we proceeded to transfer the virus. And when he says that, he is quick to clarify what he means by that. He says, meaning the collected material and mucus secretions from the mouth and throat and bronchi in cases of disease. So that's what he means when he says they transferred the virus. So they transferred the mucus secretions from the mouth and throat of those who are sick. And it says, for example, in this particular experiment, they used 1 cc and sprayed that into each nostril of the volunteer, into the throat and the eyes. None of them became sick. Then they filtered that material, because now they said maybe it's not the bacillus, maybe it's not the bacteria that's giving us problems, so let's filter the bacteria out and just use the filtrate. So they did that and used it on other volunteers. We are told it produced no results. Other volunteers, 10 in number this time, received 6 cc. The first one was 1 cc. So it said, okay, let's add this amount. Maybe we are using too little. So they used 6 cc this time of the mixed stuff and sprayed it into each nostril, the throat, and the eyes. And they asked the volunteers to swallow the rest. They did. And we are told no one became sick. Now, in another experiment, they decided to put the sick and the healthy subjects next to each other, side by side. Then they would take swabs and they would take material, the secretions, directly from the nose of the sick person into the nose of the healthy subject to make sure no time was wasted in between and that whatever they were transferring was not messed up with. So they did that. And we are told they also tried to get some of the secretions from the tonsils and from the posterior nasopharynx, so as far back your throat as they could. They used 19 volunteers for that particular experiment. And they made sure that the sick subjects were in their first day of disease. That's the time we are told viral infections are most infectious. So they made sure the unhealthy subjects, the ones they were getting the secretions from, were in their first day of disease. Others were in their second and third day. We are told none of the volunteers who received that material directly transferred from cases of disease became sick in any way. The next experiment, they decided to stick to injections of blood. So they took 5 donors, 5 cases of influenza in the febrile stage, some of them quite early in the disease. So they drew 20 cc this time from the arm vein of each, and they made a total of 100 cc. They mixed that, and then 10 cc of that blood was injected into 10 volunteers. None of them became sick in any way. Now, I think you're getting the the results are becoming familiar, right? Then they collected a lot of mucus material from the upper respiratory tract, filtered it through Mandler filters, and then they made sure that bacteria of ordinary size was filtered out. And only ultramicroscopic organisms could pass. They injected that filtrate into 10 volunteers. And each one received 3.5 cc. Now, I think you know the results already. None of the volunteers got sick in any way. Now, then they decided, okay, now let's give up this thing and try to imitate the way we think this disease spreads. So they decided to go through that process. So 10 volunteers from Gallop's Island went to the Naval Hospital where the sick were. And they went into a ward that had 30 beds, all filled with influenza patients. Then the volunteers were asked to sit alongside the bed of the patient. They would shake hands, and by instruction, they were to get as close as they could conveniently do and talk to the patient for 5 minutes. Now, at the end of the 5 minutes, the patient would breathe out as hard as he could, and the volunteer was asked to breathe in as deeply as he could. Now, I know no such experiments can be done anymore, but it's good that we have this record. It says they would do that muzzle to muzzle. That's about 2 inches away from each other. Now, how close is 2 inches? Can you put your hand 2 inches from your face? I think we can all do that to get an idea of how close. So the faces were supposed to be that close. So they would do that, and then for another 5 minutes. So they would repeat that 5 times. So you would sit where the patient was, shake hands, talk, come 2 inches to their face, breathe in the breath they were breathing out. And they repeated that 5 times. And we are told they did it very faithfully. After they had done that, we are told the patient coughed directly into the face of the volunteer, face to face, 5 different times. Now, after the volunteer had had that sort of contact with one patient, they were supposed to go to the next patient and go through that cycle 10 times, meaning 10 patients. Now, the volunteers were observed for 7 days, and we are told none of them became sick in any way. And this doctor confesses and says, we entered the outbreak with a notion that we knew the cause of the disease. And we were quite sure we knew how it was transmitted from person to person. And then he confesses, perhaps if we have learned anything, it is that we are not quite sure what we know about this disease. Now, they did other experiments in a different island, because they said, okay, the volunteers we have used in this island at some point had a case of influenza. So perhaps they have developed some natural immunity. So let us deal with people who have never had this disease, who have no immunity, as we understand immunity, that is, who have no immunity. So they went to San Francisco and they repeated those same experiments. And I think by now you know the results. None of the volunteers got sick. Only one person got sick, but they did not get influenza. They got a sore throat from all the scratching and smearing. They got a sore throat for a day and recovered the next day. They could not reproduce the disease in any way. Now, these same experiments were done for chicken pox, for measles, but inoculations of blood and other secretions could not reproduce the disease. Now, all those experiments are public record. So those who are interested can go and read them. I don't want to say more about that. And because we do not have much time today, I would also encourage you to go and read a book called The Poisoned Needle by Dr. Eliana McBean. She was exposed to the polio pandemic. They called it, okay, I'm not sure it was a pandemic. But she was exposed to that time when they had a lot of polio cases. And if you read the book, there was no contagion. You could not infect anyone else with the disease. But that's a story for another day. So the question, is it on our screens yet? Oh, today we are not fortunate. Okay. So throughout their research in trying to establish what was causing the Spanish flu, one thing became evident: the impossibility of reproducing that disease in another human being. There was no way you could infect another person with flu. Let me put it that simply. But going back to our lecture yesterday, we said when you look through the electronic microscope, you do see something. You see nanoparticles. Now, the nanoparticles there, the electron microscope gives us pictures. It does not give us a video. So we do not know. We cannot even tell whether the nanoparticles are coming from the cell or whether they are going into the cell. It tells us nothing. But the question remains, what might these nanoparticles be? What are these? Because there are nanoparticles near the cell wall. Wherever they come from, nobody can tell. So the question we should be asking are, what are they? What are these things? Now, there are plenty of vesicles, microvesicles in your body that are released from the plasma membrane. For example, we have what they call CCVs, clathrin-coated vesicles. Now, when we were describing viruses at the beginning of our lecture, what did we say they are? Or how are they described? We forgot. we need to review that. But we say they are clothed in what? A protein coat. Now, there are plenty of microvesicles that have the same coat. Now, I do not want to go through all of them. I want to mention some, and then we're going to look at one in a little more detail. So we have microvesicles. We have apoptotic bodies. Now, these ones are generated during apoptosis, when your cells die. Now, when your cells die, what happens? What do your cells contain? You have DNA. So when your cells die, what happens? You end up with free strands of nucleoprotein that look like viruses. So it is very possible to confuse those with what people think are viruses. And then we have oncosomes. These are released from cancer cells. And then we have others that are called exosomes. Now, I really wished we could have that screen today because I wanted you to look at something here. Now, let's look at exosomes briefly. Now, exosomes are small membrane-bound vesicles that carry macromolecules from the site of production to target sites, either in their microenvironment or distant away from the cell where they are produced. Now, we are told that the cell membrane forms inwards. It creates a liquid vesicle called an endosome. Then proteins, messenger RNA, and microRNA enter the endosome, forming what we are calling exosome. Then the endosome fuses outwards, and the exosome is released outside the cell. Now, exosomes are found in blood, in milk, and all other body fluids. Now, I want you to think about it. When we talk about viruses, where do we say they are found? Where are they found? Now, let's talk about HIV, for example. When they tell a mother she has HIV, what do they advise her not to do? Not to breastfeed. Why? Because they say you will pass the virus. Now, exosomes are found in blood, in milk, and in all other body fluids. Now, what induces their production? Now, number one, we have toxic substances. Every time you are exposed to something toxic, you produce a lot of exosomes. Stress, fear, they are produced also as an immune response. When you have asthma, you produce a lot of exosomes. Ionizing radiation, like what you are exposed to during X-rays. Any form of disease, any form of electromagnetic radiation, and your body in response produces exosomes. Now, what do they do? It's theorized, I'm careful to say that, it's theorized that they act as a sponge. They prevent the toxins from attacking the cell. So when there is a crisis, they come around the cell and form a protection, a protective wall, by taking in the toxins themselves. But it's also understood that exosomes serve as a mechanism for cell-to-cell communication for purposes of healing, repair, and construction. For example, when there is inflammation, they can up-regulate it or down-regulate it. They can deal with toxicity. They can deal with production of stem cells. Now, we still don't have the screen, but I wanted to show you a comparison here of exosomes and what is thought to be COVID-19 virus. And I wanted us to look at the characteristics of exosomes and COVID-19. Now, for example, we are told that the diameter inside the cell of the COVID-19 virus is 500 nanometers. Now, guess what we are told the diameter inside the exosome is? 500 nanometers. Now, we are told that it binds to a receptor called ACE2. Now, exosomes bind to that same receptor. We are told the COVID-19 virus contains RNA. Now, exosomes contain RNA. Now, we are told COVID-19 is found in bronchoalveolar fluid, in lung fluid. Where are exosomes found? In all fluids, in all body fluids. So they are also found in your lung fluid. Now, someone has been studying, there's a certain researcher who has been studying HIV for years. And he came to this conclusion. Let me read it to you. Says, the virus is fully an exosome in every sense of the word. These are the words of James Hildreth. He's a HIV researcher at Johns Hopkins Hospital. You can go and read more about his research. After studying HIV for years, he came to the conclusion this which we call the virus is a what? Is an exosome. So what we call viruses, I'm sorry I'm skipping some sections. This which we call viruses are the body's own mechanism to communicate with itself for purposes of healing. And they actually proceed from the body itself. They do not come from outside. So the nanoparticles we are so excited about, that we call viruses, that we blame for all our misery, are actually the body's own way of healing itself. The presence of the so-called virions is only proof that the cells are healing and repairing themselves. And that the body should be supported to do that exact work. Now, I like this quote. This is Ministry of Healing, page 127. It says, disease is an effort of nature to free the system from conditions that result from a violation of the laws of health. So actually disease, if disease is an effort of nature to free the system from conditions that result from violation of the laws of health, then the disease itself is the cure. That which is going on is a process of repair. It is not disease in the sense that we look at it. It is something that the body should be supported to continue doing. So if your body is producing exosomes, what should you do? You should support the body to produce more. Or you should stop the reason for the production of exosomes. So the disease, that process of disease, is actually the process of cure. But some people ask, okay, what about viral loads? Now, viral loads measure the quantity of genetic material, commonly RNA, of what they call a virus that's present in the blood. Now, if there are no viruses, what would that mean? It would simply mean that your body is responding either to an internal factor or an external factor that is causing an unusual amount of cell death. So that, number one, you have all these free strands of nucleoprotein. Number two, that your body is producing exosomes at a rate that is unusual to try and deal with the condition that's happening within. But questions still come. Fine, so if that's what viral loads are about, and there is no contagion, why is it that people who are living together seem to suffer the same symptoms of disease or of the so-called viral illnesses? What happens? Now, there are several things. Number one, shared environment. When you share an environment, what are you sharing? You are also sharing the toxins in the air, in the water. You tend also to share the same toxins from pharmaceuticals. You tend to use the same drugs in that house. You're sharing stress. You're sharing food. And we know so many other things that we share. So number one, we are sharing an environment. And in that environment, we are sharing the same things that would cause our bodies to respond in the same way. But having said that, it is also good to admit that there are things we also do not understand. Now, there was an experiment that was done, I think this was 2009. Now, what they did, they used DNA, but they also used RNA, so it does not matter which one you use. And they put DNA in water, a formed strand of DNA in water. Then they took a beaker and used the same nucleoproteins that form that same DNA, but unformed in another beaker in a different room. Sorry, in another part of the room. Then they introduced an energy source on the first beaker. And in time, the same sequence of DNA or RNA, whichever one you used, would form out of the raw materials in beaker 2. Now, there was no contact between the two. There was no virus communicating anything here. But something happened. What was that? Now, they call that bioresonance. There are things that happen to people who stay together that have nothing to do with microorganisms. For example, there are other things also that have not been understood. For example, when women stay together, women who live together, what happens to them? Their menstrual cycles synchronize. They start having their cycles at the same time. What happens? Is that a viral infection? Now, there's something like laughter. Now, if one person breaks into laughter in one corner of the room, what happens to the rest of us? Even when we don't know what they are laughing about, we all start laughing. There is a certain human connection that has got nothing to do with microorganisms. If I start yawning here, what will happen to you? You'll all start yawning. So when people live together, there are things that happen which science has never understood. We may research for the next 100 years to start breaking open some of the secrets. Now, I like this quote. It says, in the Savior's parable teaching is an indication of what constitutes higher education. It says, Christ might have opened to men the deepest truths of science. He might have unlocked mysteries which have required many centuries of toil and study to penetrate. He might have made suggestions in scientific lines that would have afforded food for thought and stimulus for invention to the close of time. He would have just said one word, one, and we would have run with that for the rest of our history. But we are told he did not do this. He said nothing to gratify curiosity or to satisfy man's ambition by opening doors to worldly greatness. In all his teaching, Christ brought the mind of man in contact with the infinite mind. That's Christ's Object Lessons, page 22, paragraph 2. Is it on our screens now? It's on our screens now. All right. So there are things in this life that we will not understand this side of heaven. But that which he has revealed is ours and our children. Now, I don't know how much time I have. I think I can rush through what I have left. If I eat a little into Elder's time, I think he'll forgive me. So what is it that has been revealed to us? Now, let us to go back to the spirit of prophecy and look at causes of diseases of the respiratory organs. What is it that we are told causes our problems? Now, number one there on your screens, my list will not be comprehensive, but I want to draw your attention to some of the things that have already been revealed to us. Now, number one there says poisonous preparations. And the other words are my own addition, vaccines and other pharmaceuticals. Now, she says, this is Spiritual Gifts, Volume 4. Every poisonous preparation in the vegetable and mineral kingdoms taken into the system will leave its wretched influence, affecting the liver and lungs. And I think those who have had an interest, we have had all these studies about the implications of vaccines. After a long use and wider use, because we have more vaccines now than we have ever had, they have been leaving their wretched influence. Now, we cannot get into that now, maybe some other time. Poisoned air and unhygienic surroundings. Now, she says this is how to live. Page 4. You can read this for yourself. Many suffer decayed vegetable matter to remain about their premises. And there is constantly arising from these decaying substances an effluvium that is poisoning the air. By inhaling the impure air, the blood is poisoned. The lungs become affected and the whole system is diseased. Simple things with great implications. Number 3, living in damp and swampy areas. We are told if a house is built where water settles around it, remaining for a time and then drying away, a poisonous miasma arises. And fever, ague, sore throat, lung diseases, and fevers will be the result. Living in swampy places. Now, you'll notice this words, what I have highlighted, the poisonous miasma. Now, we as the Adventist Church have been trying to distance ourselves from this miasma thing, because before they convinced us that there were viruses, everyone believed that the problem with lung issues was a poisonous miasma. And when the virus theory came in, everyone tried to distance themselves from what they called the miasma theory. And as a church, we have taken this apologetic stance. Say, yes, Ellen White believed in miasma at one point, but she outgrew that theory. Now, we will talk about that another time. We're told, especially in wet seasons, the sleeping rooms become damp, and those who sleep in the beds are troubled with rheumatism, neuralgia, and lung complaints, which end up in consumption or tuberculosis. Lack of fresh air. Number 4, we are told many families suffer from sore throat, lung diseases, and liver complaints brought upon them by their own course of action. Now, remember what we said about disease initially. When we read Counsels to Health, we said it is a sin to be sick, for disease is a transgression of the laws of what? Of health. Says here, most of these lung diseases and liver complaints are brought upon them by whose course of action? That person's course of action. I know that does not sound good. It's easier to blame a virus. Now they keep their windows and doors closed, fearing they will take cold if there is a crevice to let in the air. They breathe the same air over and over until it becomes impregnated with poisonous impurities and waste matter thrown off from their own bodies through the lungs and pores of the skin. Number 5, overheated atmosphere. We are told for invalids who have feeble lungs, nothing can be worse than an overheated atmosphere. The heated, oppressed atmosphere, deprived of vitality, benumbs the sensitive brain. The lungs contract, the liver is inactive. Do we have a virus there? Now, finally, there is someone you can blame. I know it's good to have someone to blame. Here is one. It says, while appearing to the children of men as a great physician who can heal all their maladies, he will bring disease and disaster. Whom are we talking about? The devil, yes. until populous cities are reduced to ruin and desolation. Even now he is at work in accidents and calamities by sea and by land, in great conflagrations, in fierce tornadoes and terrific hailstorms, in tempests, floods, cyclones, tidal waves, and earthquakes. In every place and in 1,000 forms, Satan is exercising his power. And we are told he sweeps away the ripening harvest, and famine and distress follow. He imparts to the air a deadly taint. Now, I think a lot of people have been reading in that statement, he creates viruses and releases them into the air. Now, he imparts to the air a deadly taint. I prefer to read, he poisons the air, and thousands perish by the pestilence. Why poison the air? Because that's consistent with all the other things we have read. We poison the air when we overheat it. We poison the air when we do not have a free flow of oxygen. We poison the air when we allow decaying matter to rest around our houses. We have poisoned air when we live in swampy areas that dry up. And when they are drying up, we are told there is a deadly taint that comes from them. These visitations, we are told, will become more and more frequent and disastrous. Now, I don't want to conclude before I read this statement. Now, it is important to remember what the church stand on vaccination is. We are told that the Seventh-day Adventist Church places a strong emphasis. By the way, this statement was released in 2015. A strong emphasis on health. It is based, we are told, on biblical revelation. I have no problem with that. And the inspired writings of E.G. White. I think that's where we should stop our emphasis on health. But we are told that emphasis on health is also based on peer-reviewed scientific literature. As such, we encourage responsible immunization, vaccination, and have no religious or faith-based reason not to encourage our adherents to responsibly participate in immunization programs. The choice not to be immunized is not and should not be seen as the dogma nor the doctrine of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Now, having read that, I think we should finish on this note. Because speaking of the natural health, protective, and healing methods that God sanctions, A.G. White, his prophet, clarifies and says now she was talking about the 8 laws of health. She said they are given to the well to keep them well. What do we take to keep ourselves well? What do we do? Shout it to me. Otherwise, I may have to repeat this lesson, and it is more than an hour long. What is it that we do to keep ourselves well? Yes? Somebody is saying it, but they're too timid. Yes? Now, according to conventional practice of medicine, what is it that we do to keep our children and ourselves well? Yes, we vaccinate well. We vaccinate them. Now, we are told those 8 laws of health are given us to keep us well, and to the sick to make them well. So whether you're sick or ill, what have we been given as a solution to our problems? The 8 laws of health. And we are told, connected with water treatment, they are more effective in restoring health than all the drug medication in the world. Now, I believe that statement is as current and relevant as anything can be. Now, let me finish that statement. It says, near the close of her life, God's messenger affirmed, those who take a medical training spend a great deal of time learning that which is merely rubbish. I need not add. Psalm 91 verse 3 says, surely he will deliver thee from the snare of the fowler and from the noisome pestilence. He shall cover thee with his feathers, and under his wings thou shalt thou trust. His truth shall be thy shield and buckler. Thou shalt not be afraid for the terror by night, nor for the arrow that flieth by day, nor for the pestilence that walketh in darkness, nor for the destruction that wasteth at noonday. 1,000 shall fall at thy side, and 10,000 at thy right hand. But it shall not come nigh thee. Only with thine eyes shalt thou behold and see the reward of the wicked. Because thou hast made the Lord, which is my refuge, even the Most High, thy habitation. There shall no evil befall thee, neither shall any plague come nigh thy dwelling. That's the promise to God's people. But if they be God's people, then they shall live according to his instruction. They shall allow him to be the healer of their bodies as well as their souls. May God bless you. Shall we all rise for a word of prayer? If you're able to stand, kindly rise so that we can pray together. We are praying. Our Father and our God which art in heaven, we thank you for your greatness. We thank you for your goodness. And we acknowledge this day that your ways are not our ways. It's my prayer this morning that you may teach us to bring our ways into harmony with your ways, that we may take care of ourselves according to the instructions that you have given us. Be with us now and in the rest of the programs. Pray that you may continue teaching us, that you may revive us again and prepare us for your soon return. It's my prayer in Jesus' name.
We like to thank the Lord for the message through Sister Joyce on health. I think she shared a lot of new elements and perspectives about our health that will help promote our health, physical health, and also link it up with the spiritual health. Thank you very much, and I appreciate the contribution of Sister Joyce.